get started. All right, so this is a web stack. It's going to be HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, just the vanilla stuff. Um, all this stuff is basically how your browser will translate information and show it to users. Um, so this is the agenda for today. I don't know how long it's going to take to get through. Might be quick, might take a long time, but um, we're going to go over the HTML document structure. We're going to talk about HTML elements. We're going to get a little bit of CSS intro, talk about links and how to separate out your files so that you're not working in one giant file. And then we'll get into some fun JavaScript stuff, which is what I'm kind of trying to get to because this is the fun stuff. So, are there any questions or any issues that anyone has had setting up their dev environments or anything before we get started?
I think it would be helpful to kind of go through what we're supposed to have because it was kind of confusing. Downloading all this stuff, and I think I have it all, but I'm not sure.
Okay, sure. Um, so let me go to resources. Nope, I put it in Wiki. Um, so everyone has Chrome, I assume, right? We're
Mm.
good on that one. Okay.
Yes.
And then VS Code. Any issues downloading that?
So in terms of that, I don't have. I'm not using VS Code. I'm using Sublime. Is that too
That
big of an
works just
issue?
as
Or?
well. Yeah, if you already had something set up, you're good.
Okay, cool.
Anybody else have any issues with VS Code or anything?
Nope, seems to be fine for me.
Okay, sweet. Um, and then Commander is just kind of a nice tool to have if you're on Windows, but it's not 100% necessary. I would just like to be able to explain the same commands for everyone, and it kind of makes the Windows command line the same as the Mac command line as far as commands go. And that one is actually a little funky to set up because you don't get like a start menu shortcut or anything, I don't think. Maybe you do. Um, but you can just open it from like your downloads folder. Um, so wherever you downloaded the exe to, you can just open it from there. And then Git, basically if you downloaded and went through the installer for Git, you have it. We're not really going to talk about Git yet. Um, and then Node.js we're also not really going to talk about yet, but I will show you how to use it a little bit. And then a GitHub account. Does everyone have a GitHub account?
Yes.
Yeah, I set one up.
Sweet.
I don't yet, but I will do that.
Cool. And for anyone who doesn't know, that's just where you push your code to as you're writing it, just to have a kind of cloud storage for your code. Um, yeah, okay. Any questions on any of that?
I guess we're going to talk later about like what each of these things are and what they do, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Cool.
I think, I guess I didn't really type out, but VS Code is where you'll just like type your code basically and run it and everything. And that's kind of the main one that I wanted to make sure everyone has for tonight. All right.
Yeah, I have that.
Sweet.
Mm-hmm.
Rock and roll then. Um, so I'll move on to the first section, which is HTML. If anyone has questions during this, feel free to just like completely interrupt me. No big deal, because this format is very new to me teaching online. Okay, so first off, I just want to give everyone a brief overview of the client-server relationship. Um, so we've got a client and we've got a server. And the client is always going to be your web browser, at least when we're talking about the web. And the way that the internet kind of routes things is you send off a request to a server for the data that you want. Um, and the request goes along and asks the server for that data, and it responds with the data that you asked for. So this is pretty high level, but that's basically how the web browser works. And so anytime you go to a website like google.com, for instance, you're going to ask Google for google.com, and it's going to send back all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript for google.com, and then that's what gets rendered on your web page. And then I kind of wrote down the request and response codes. We will definitely be getting into this in another class, but for now, I mean, these are kind of the basic ones. So if the client were to send up a post request, then that would mean that it's adding data to the server or creating something in a database. Get is kind of the most common one. That's where you're retrieving data. Put would be updating data, and delete is deleting data. And then response codes. I think 404 is the one that like everyone's kind of seen before, but you also have 200, which means that the data you sent up is good and the data coming back is what's supposed to be coming back. You have 400, which is bad request, which means that the way you formatted your request is bad and not what the server was expecting. And then 401 is unauthorized, so if you're not logged in or something, then you wouldn't be able to access whatever website that was. So that's my basic high-level overview of the client-server relationship. Moving on to HTML document structure. So
And we're gonna be going over that again, right?
over this?
The words, request codes, and stuff, and just
Oh yeah,
how
for
to
sure.
do them. Okay, cool.
When we
Thanks.
start talking about interaction with servers and APIs and things like that, we will get into that. But for now, we're going to stick to your machine. So you won't really have to worry about this. I just wanted to kind of explain it real quick. All right. So HTML document structure. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. It's not a programming language per se, but it's a way to describe the structure of a web page, and it provides some like default formatting. It's easier to think of it more as like a Word document than a programming language per se. It doesn't do any calculations on its own. No input or output or anything. It just kind of describes what the web page is going to look like, basically, in the content. So in HTML, we use tags to define the structure of our web page. They look like this. So you've got an opening angle bracket, the name of the tag, closing angle bracket, and then in between the opening tag and the closing tag here, you've got whatever content you want to display. So tag without the slash is an opening tag, and then this one with the slash, starting with the slash, is a closing tag. And they can also be nested, so like you see over here or like down here, you can put child elements inside of parent elements. And these are called elements or tags. They're kind of interchangeable, but they mean the same thing. So this is very, very quick HTML overview. Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, I'm good on my end.
Cool. Moving forward then, we're going to talk about some elements. And this next page is kind of a nightmare, so bear with me. These are some of the most common elements used, and the ones you'll see in like day-to-day HTML stuff. Div just denotes a section of the page, so there's no default styles. It doesn't really do anything, but it's an element that you can put other elements inside of, basically. So more of a container. H1 through H6 is a heading tag, H1 is the biggest, H6 is the smallest, so that's like bolded text. Usually use those at like the top of a page or whatever. P is the paragraph tag. That's what you use when you're typing out any long form text. Span is like div, but it is inline. So in HTML we have inline elements and we have block elements. Block elements will stretch the entire width of the page, or the containing element, the parent element. And inline elements will kind of sit next to each other. So span will sit next to like another span that you put next to it on the page. And I'll show you examples of all of this in just a sec. Button is going to be your basic button. They don't look very good default, but you can style them nicely. We'll get into that. Input, again, just a basic input. You'll notice that this one has the slash right there. That means that it is a self-closing tag, so you don't have to do the opening and the closing tag. You just do the input itself with the slash. And then we've got select, which is like a drop-down selector. Option will always go inside of a select element, so as a child, and that's where you put the options. UL is an unordered list. Oh, I've got I know LI is under there. Or OL. OL is an ordered list, so that'll have numbers next to it. A is an anchor tag or a link, and image is an image tag. And those are kind of all the basic ones, the ones that we use all the time. And I feel like I should just show some of them. So I'm going to pop open VS Code.
I have a question.
Yeah, what's up?
I was gonna, like, I don't know if you already explained it, but what do you mean when you say parent and child?
Yeah, sure. So let me go back here. So when we're talking about parent and child, you'll notice how in this code here, you've got HTML at the top as the opening tag, and HTML is at the bottom as the closing tag. So anything inside of the opening HTML and the closing HTML is a child of that element. And when we get into like styling and things with CSS, you can style the child elements by styling the parent element. So things that are applied to the parent element will also be applied to the child element. So title is a child of head, H1 and P are childs of body, and then everything in here is a child of HTML. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, that does. Thank you.
Yeah. So cool tip, and let's see if I can, yeah, there we go. One of the reasons I wanted everyone to have VS Code is it has a lot of default helpful things, and one of them is if you type doc and you hit tab, it'll kind of stub out a default HTML template for you. So I don't think I've typed this code, like the HTML head body, since like the day I started programming, pretty much, because you can always just type doc tab and it'll do it for you. So that's very nice. One thing that I failed to mention in this slide is the title tag, and the title tag always goes inside of the head, and this is the title that will show like in your Chrome or browser tab. So open up Google Chrome. If I go to google.com, up here where it says Google, that is where you define that right here. So I'm just going to call it test for now, and we're going to look at some of these elements. So we can start with div, even though there's nothing really to see here. And I'm going to have to open this up, so I'll show you all how to do this. So there you go. That's what happens when you do a div. It basically just puts the text on the page. No styling or anything. Normally, if you want any text to display to the user or in the client, you do not want to just put it directly inside of a div or directly inside of the body. You probably want to wrap it in either an H 1 through 6 tag or a P tag or a span tag. Because you kind of just don't want that floating text just sitting around, and it's hard to style if it's not within a tag. So yeah, so that's a div tag. Let's do an H1. Also, if you just, in VS Code, if you just type like the name of a tag and you hit tab, it'll do the opening and closing tag for you. So that's pretty nice as well. So H1, whoops, oh, I messed that up. And then we also have H2, and all the way up to H6. I won't type them all out, but they all do exist. And that will look like this. So H1 is going to be our biggest header, and then we have a little bit smaller, and then all the way down to H6, which is actually just smaller than the plain text on the page. So people don't really use H6, but H1 is a nice, useful one. Next up, we've got the paragraph tag. This is just going to look like normal text. Not really anything special to it. There's that. Span I don't really need to show. Basically just going to look the same as div. But I will show that. So if I put a div right here and I say this is a div, and then I put the P tag next to it, you'll notice that they go above and below each other like this because they are block elements. However, if I wanted something to be inline, I can't remember if P tag is inline or block. Let me check real quick. It is block. Let's see, I gotta think of another inline element. Button might be. Yeah, so if I use a button, which is an inline element, and a span next to it, they'll go right next to each other instead of on top of each other. So that's kind of the difference between block elements and inline elements. So now we've seen button 2. We can look at input, which is self-closing. VS Code doesn't do the slash at the end, and really the browser doesn't necessarily need it. I do it because when I started programming, you needed it, but they've kind of made it so you don't really need it anymore. So there's an input. We can type in there. And we've got select. And I can show you option 2 because option goes inside of select. So we'll give it a name. This is our select. Option goes inside. Value.
What's that ID thing?
We will get to that.
Okay.
I think it's on the next slide actually. Like this type, name, value, all that stuff we will talk about in just a minute. I didn't know that VS Code would automatically add them, but that's kind of nice. Yeah, so now we have like a little drop down selector. So yeah, option always goes inside of a select. And then, so for ULs and for OLs, you define your list elements. So they're actually called list items with LI. So the first item in my unordered list is item 1. Second element is item 2. And then we can basically do the same with ordered lists. So this will give me actual numbers next to the list items. So this is our bullet pointed list or unordered, and this is our ordered list. These are also not super commonly used, but I thought I'd include them because they're nice to have on hand. And you'll notice that this looks bad. Everything looks bad right now because HTML itself just doesn't really do anything that looks nice. And that's where CSS will come in, and we'll get to that.
I've used unordered lists and ordered lists a lot when doing things in AppScript. If you need to like format an email, you use HTML to like format it. So there's a lot of, I can see how like if you're making a website, you might not use it quite as much. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that nowadays most things aren't written in just plain HTML. Everyone's using a library to style the web page.
Yeah.
So a lot of times they have like they're not using actual list elements because those are harder to style for some reason, and we'll use like a div and a span with different like class names on them that can be styled differently. It's more complex, but they're definitely used UL and OL. Not to say that they're useless. I just don't typically see them in my like day-to-day work. So we have A tags, which are links, and they look like that, nice and purple. And last one is image, which I can show you an example of if I had a image source. This one a GIF. Sure. Sure, give me the Halloween GIF. We're going to talk about this as well, so don't get too concerned. There we go. Now we have a GIF on the page. And now we've got a nice web page. We built a web page already. Good job, everyone. Does anyone have any questions on any of these things? I know I just kind of sped through that, but if anyone needs any help.
I was wondering if like you're gonna go over like maybe in more detail, and this is maybe something I can research on my own as well, just like what the little things you were typing meant and like how you did that on your keyboard and stuff, or like I don't know the words and stuff.
The tags themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Maybe that's something that the website gave you automatically, like viewport and width and stuff.
Oh, this stuff? Yeah.
Mhm.
I can explain these really quick. So these are meta tags. They are not really super frequently used, but these two will be set up automatically when you do your doc and then you hit tab. It kind of just adds these for you. Charset is the encoding for the website, which is just the way that it's going to display text. So if you wanted to display like kanji or like different characters, you might need a different charset for that. But UTF-8 is kind of the standard for web stuff. And this one, it creates automatically so that you can view this website on mobile devices. So it sets the initial scale to 1.0. I don't really ever like think about these, and you don't really ever have to either, but if you want more in-depth knowledge on that, I can definitely send resources for that.
Okay, thank you. That makes so much more sense.
Okay, sweet. Yeah, sorry about that. I totally just glossed over the whole doc thing. All right, that is our basic HTML elements. Oh, and then I mentioned this briefly, but yeah, some tags are self-closing, like image and input, and you just use the slash at the end, or if you're in VS Code, it won't put the slash at the end for you, and that doesn't matter. You can do it either way, whatever looks better to you. but you don't need a closing tag is the main thing. Cool. Next up, attributes, which I think Jack asked a question about. So HTML attributes go inside the tags before the closing bracket, like this. So, oh god, like this. So this is the name of our attribute, and this is the value of our attribute. And they are always used like this, where we have the name of the attribute equals sign, and then in quotes the value of the attribute. And these are some of them do different things. Like for instance, href is like a link reference. So if you were to do an a tag, it's going to automatically make a href for you, and this is where your link will actually take you. And then inside the tag is like what you want it to say. So you can have it say anything you want, but in here is where it's actually going to take you when you click on the link. So that's one example of an attribute. Another important one, and probably like the biggest one that y'all should remember, is class. And we'll talk about how we use this once we get into CSS, but the class lets you select that element and style it specifically. So if we had like a div, for instance, and we wanted all the text in here to be red, we could put a class on this called red, and then when we get into CSS, I'll show you how to define these selectors, but you would have a selector for red, and you would say anything that has the class red on it will be styled red. So we could have like a p tag as well with the class red, and this will also be red. But right now it won't, because this doesn't mean anything to the HTML yet until you define that in your CSS. Does that make sense? I just said a lot of words.
Yes, it does.
Awesome. Another one is ID. It's like class, except for you can only have one per page, or you should only have one per page. So you can have multiple ID attributes, but the ID names that go in here, the actual value, should be unique to the HTML document. And then href, I kind of already talked about, which is a link. And then source. Source, I don't know if the only two elements that use it are script and image, but those are kind of the most used ones. So, and I didn't talk
When
about
you
script
say
yet.
link,
Yeah.
do you mean the same thing as like when you get a link sent to you? Is it
Yes.
different?
Yes, exactly. So I'll show you a quick example. If I set up my doc again, and I do an a tag, and in here I go to google.com is the only thing I can think of as an example. And then in here I say, this will take you to Google. Now if we go to our web page, we have this link, and when we click on it, it's going to try to take us to Google, but it doesn't know how to get there without an HTTP. I think that'll work. Go back. Yeah. So yeah, same thing. When someone sends you a link, when you can click on it, it's pretty much the same as this. Cool. Any questions on attributes yet?
I do have a question. I'm not understanding, like, IDs should be unique within the page. Like, what's the different, like, can you kind of show like a practical example of like the difference between that and how class works?
Sure. And this will make more sense once we get into CSS, because ID and class are the main things you use to like style your web page, and CSS is how you do that. But When I'm talking about being unique within the page, I mean that if I have a div here with an ID of my div, I wouldn't want to have a second div or a second element at all with the ID of my div. But I could have this be like my second div, right? So we can use multiple IDs, but we don't want them to have the same value because our CSS will get confused by that because it's only expecting us to have one ID value per page. Whereas if these were classes, these could both be whatever red, and they would get styled the same way based on what we set up in our CSS. Does that make
Okay,
more sense?
that makes sense. Thanks.
Cool. Yeah. Any other questions on attributes? Alrighty. Cool. Now we get into CSS. We're moving along quickly. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets. They're called Cascading Style Sheets because they are how we style our page, and they are read from top to bottom. So I'll tell you how to be more like careful about that. But basically, if you define something somewhere at the top and then you define it again at the bottom, it's going to read the bottom one and not the top one. So you have to be careful not to use multiple of the same CSS rule sets. CSS describes how HTML elements are to be displayed on screen, paper, or in other media. I copied this from somewhere, obviously, because I would not write paper in another media. CSS saves a lot of work. It can control the layout of multiple web pages all at once, and external style sheets are stored in .css files. So, like how we have index.html, we could also have a styles.css file. And we'll talk about, when I get to the links slide, we'll talk about how to link those all together, which is something that really confused me when I first started and no one really taught me how to do. So I'd like everyone to kind of understand that concept. A CSS rule set consists of a selector and a declaration block. So they look like this, kind of. Your selector, and then your declaration. So the declaration will be wrapped in these squiggly brackets, and then you have the property and the values. And you can have as many of these as you want within a declaration block. So like color blue, font size 12 pixels, that could go on for thousands of lines if you wanted to make your H1s look really crazy. And in this instance, the selector H1 will select every H1 on the page and make the color blue and make the font size 12 pixels. So no matter how many you have on your HTML page, they're all going to get styled like this. And this is kind of a better example of how you write them. Usually you do the selector here, the opening squiggly bracket, the actual declaration block, and then the closing squiggly bracket. I know that's a lot. Does all that make sense so far?
Yeah.
Is this gonna be the different website you sent us? See, or is this also done in the one you were using before?
The one that I'm making right now?
Yeah. Can you do that in there?
Yes, we can do it all in the same file, but I highly recommend not doing that. So if we wanted
Okay.
to, we could just go in here and make a style tag. And inside of the style tag, we can start writing CSS. So if I wanted to do like what this does here and change all the H1s to blue, I could do that. And if I write any H1s within the body, sure this is gonna work. Yeah. So now that's blue. However, we are going to separate these out into separate files. And you can also write JavaScript right in here in the HTML file, but I also recommend not doing that. So yeah, we'll talk about that. But before the end of this presentation, I will explain how it all comes together, and we'll make something that looks cool, or at least fun. All right, let's move on to selectors. An element is selected by default if you do not lead with a selector character. So for example, when we style this H1, we just say H1, and it knows that we want to style all the H1s on the page. Classes can be selected with a dot. So you put a dot before it, and then you say the name of the class. So if this H1 had a class of, class of red on it, and in our style down here, we said dot red, color is red. And when we go to our site, that H1 is red. But if we make another H1, and we don't put the class red on it, that one's not red. So that's kind of a quick example of classes. IDs basically work the same way. They can be selected with the hash symbol, and then the name of the ID. So in this instance, if I change this to the ID, and I change this dot into that guy, when we reload, we see the same thing. And I can change the color of this. There we go. Does all that make sense so far?
I had a quick question.
Yeah.
In terms of ID and class, so I know the difference between them is that ID, you don't really want as many in the code as class. I mean, they'll have to be kind of unique. They all have to be unique. Is there anything in particular that we would use ID for that we wouldn't use for class?
No, not as far as styling in CSS goes. And I recommend kind of against using IDs. It's a little bit old school, I think.
Okay.
So yeah, basically we pretty much always use class. Even if you're only using it once, it's going to work the same way as an ID, and you don't have to worry about the CSS screwing things up. So
Okay.
pretty much always stick to class. There are some instances where you need an ID. The one off the top of my head is if we're doing an input, and we want a label for that input. This for here is going to take an ID of the input that it's supposed to be for. However, that only really matters if once we are sending up data to a server. So we'll get into that for sure, but for now, pretty much stay away from using IDs. You always want to use classes.
All right, cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
In classes, you said identify the color of your design or text.
So not necessarily. The class is just a kind of placeholder so that you can select this element and style it however you want. So once we have the class red in here in the H1, we can then do whatever we want to it because we have access to this H1 element from the CSS. So it's not just color. There are a lot of different declarations in CSS. There was font size in the last slide. We can do 100 pixels and make it really big. There's tons of them, and I'll talk some more about some other ones. I think at the end of this, I'll just have kind of a free coding session, and you guys can just tell me what to do, and I'll just do it and kind of walk you through it. But yeah, it basically just tells you what element you want to select. So the next part of selectors is where it gets a little bit confusing. which is that they can be nested and they can also be chained. So nesting, let's say we don't want to have a class on this h1, but we do want to put it inside of a div. And now we don't have a class, so we can't really select this specifically without selecting this one as well, unless we do a nested selector. So to do that, we would select the div first, which is the parent element, and then we would select the child element, which is the one that we actually want to affect. When you're nesting these, the last one that you put in is always going to be the actual element that you are going to affect. So, so we only want this first h1 up here to be styled in red. So we do div, then a space, and then h1. So only h1s that are inside of divs will be styled. Let's make it red again. And there you go. So we have one red and one black. Now, if we were to put this one inside of a div as well, now it's going to grab both of them and make them both red. Does that make sense?
Makes sense to me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And these can go on for longer than just 2 as well. So if we had like a p tag inside of a div with an h1 inside of that, I don't know why you'd ever do that, but you could style it that way, and it would grab that element, whatever the last one is in the list. So this is child, parent, grandparent, I guess. And then what was the other thing I talked about? Oh, being chained. Oh, and I forgot to put something else in here as well, but I'll talk about it right now. So they can also be chained. And if you chain them, then that means that you're specifically styling the element with all of the attributes that you specify. And I don't know how to explain that any better without just showing you, so I will do that now. So if we have this h1 with a class of purple, and we want all the h1s to be font size 100 pixels, let's say. Now when we go to our page, we've got 2 big h1s. Now if I want to specifically specify this purple one, I can just do dot purple, and it will specify that that's the one I want to grab, and we can make it purple. But if you want to get more specific and say that if I have a paragraph element with the class of purple, I don't want to style this to be purple. So right now, anything with the class purple on it is going to be turned purple. So we've got this little baby down here. But we only want the h1 to be styled purple. So we can do h1 dot purple with no space in between. And that will style just this one. So this changed back to black, even though I'm not sure if you can see that. So that's chaining. These can also be done over and over again. You can also use IDs in here, and you just squish them next to each other, and as long as it has all of the attributes in there, then you are good. And then the other thing that I wanted to mention real quick that I forgot to talk about is inside this class attribute, you can actually specify more than one class. So you never want to put 2 class attributes on an element like this. That will break things, and it will, I think it will do the last one that's red. So if I have class purple, class red, it's only going to apply class red. Let me see if that's true. Nope, that's not true. So it only applies to the first one. That was backwards. But you can put multiple classes on something. Like if we wanted to have a big class and a red class, you can do it like this. So it's just separated by a space. And we can have the dot big and dot red. And now that first one should be big and red. Does that make sense? So this has both classes on it now because we put them both on like that.
Oh, that's cool. I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah, it's pretty handy, especially when you start working with frameworks that bring in a lot of random classes. And that's all that CSS libraries or frameworks really are, is a bunch of classes for your HTML. And a lot of times you want to use their helper classes. Like they'll have stuff like red or primary, which will be like the primary color of your website. And you'll want it to be primary, but you also want it to be left aligned or whatever, so you can chain those as much as you want.
Oh, awesome.
Yeah. Anyone have any questions on classes or chaining or nesting? I think those are the last three things I talked about. Cool. All right. Hopefully I'm explaining well enough that y'all can understand. I'm also going to upload this Google Slides and just let you all go through it if you'd like. And I'll post this video as well to the website so y'all can see it when we're done. All right. And then we'll talk about links. So this is where I was talking about separating out your files. It's a good practice. It's not necessary. You can write everything right in the HTML file, but it can get pretty hairy pretty quick. So you can separate your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files. And the way we do that is by using HTML elements to pull resources into our web page. So for instance, we use the link element to pull in a CSS file like this. So we have link. There's a rel attribute, which is the relationship to our web page. If we're pulling in a CSS file, that's always going to be style sheet. And then we have the href, which is the link or the location where the CSS file is stored. And then link is also a self-closing tag, so I put that slash there. And then when we start talking about JavaScript, the way you pull in a JavaScript file is with the script tag. And you just do script with the source or src attribute, and this will point to the location of your script. When I say the location, when we're talking about like directories and file structures, the location will be starting at the root of wherever you are. So for instance, in my, how do I get to my home folder? In my source folder, I have this lesson 1 directory, and anything that I put in here, the index.html will be able to access directly. If I had another folder in here, like I had a bunch of CSS files that I wanted to pull in, and I wanted to pull them in from this folder, say we made a new file called styles.css, and I want to use that link tag. Do link relationship style sheet. href is going to be css slash styles.css, like that. So it always starts at the root of wherever your index.html file is. And also the naming convention for this stuff is, you'll kind of just get the hang of, but usually your starting point for your website will be index.html. Your main styles file will be called styles.css, and then people call their main JavaScript files pretty much whatever they want. I usually just do script.js, but that one's up for grabs, whoever wants to do whatever. It's cool. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yes.
Sweet. So now that we have a styles.css file, we can just directly write our styles in here instead. So let's make all of our H1s red again. And let's get rid of this style tag. And even though it's not in there, when I reload the web page, we're still going to have red on both of these. But all of our other styles went away because I deleted that style tag. This just makes it really easy to, I don't know, kind of switch between when you're looking at HTML and when you're looking at CSS. I get very confused when I see CSS in HTML. It breaks my brain a little bit. So that's links. Does all that make sense? I don't know. Links always confused me really bad when I was starting out, so I want to make sure everyone kind of understands that.
I think it'll be helpful once I get more acquainted with them and watch you do it more. But I think I get like what they are used for
Okay.
for now.
Yeah, as long as you understand the concept and that it's just pulling in another file and using that to style the web page instead of using what's in the HTML file. As long as that makes sense to you, then I think we're good. Cool. So now we get to talk about JavaScript, my favorite part. JavaScript is, I didn't even like make a main JavaScript slide. I started slacking at this point apparently. JavaScript is actually a programming language, whereas CSS and HTML are not. JavaScript is interpreted rather than compiled, which means that it is run when you load the web page. Compiled languages will store things in things like an executable file that you double click on and it opens up. And that's already like compiled code, and compiled just means that it's like converted all the way down into ones and zeros from whatever programming language it was written in, whereas JavaScript reads it line by line and kind of runs it as it's going. So you're flying by your seat of your pants in JavaScript. It does some pretty wacky stuff. It was written in 10 days in 1994, I believe. And it's only been added onto since then. So yeah, there's some pretty weird stuff that happens in JavaScript. But we'll get started with the basic kind of structure of it. And the first thing that I wanted to talk about was variables. So JavaScript variables, much like in arithmetic, are containers for storing data values. So whether that be numbers or words or whatever, that's all a variable is. There are a few ways to declare variables in JavaScript. If you're going to look up like other people's code, you might see var used a lot. But recently we kind of moved away from using var, and most everyone is using let now. So I recommend using let. And this is the syntax right here. So you do let, the name of your variable, an equal sign, and then the value for your variable. Bless you. Once we've declared our variable, we can reuse it in our script pretty much anywhere. It will hold whatever value we give it, and in this case we've given it a string, which is denoted by the single quotes. I'll talk about data types in the next slide. But the variable name can be whatever we want. It's just a reference to the value. However, you shouldn't use JavaScript keywords as your variable name. So I gave this example. This probably means nothing to anyone who's like super new, but string is something that JavaScript already knows as a keyword. So you never want to instantiate your variable as a keyword that JavaScript already knows. And then also remember that when a variable is declared with let, it can be changed at any point. So at one point in your code, you can have let x equals variable, and then in the line right below it, you can just say x equals not variable, and it will change that variable for any point below where you changed it. And then also variable name should be camel cased, so instead of just stringing words together like this, or putting spaces, which is a very bad idea, you should use this kind of format. So the first letter is lowercase, and then every word after the first word starts with an uppercase. All right, I kind of just spewed all that out. Does anyone have any questions on variables so far? Awesome. Let's talk about data types real quick. These are the 4 first ones that I thought of when I was writing this. But yeah, strings are a basic data type in JavaScript, but there are a few others. So we've got strings. String is always just going to be letters and numbers, basically. And that's that data type. Number is just a number. And this does have a max value. I don't know what it is. It's some crazy high number. But if you're ever working with huge numbers, you got to be careful of that. Then we have arrays, which is where it starts to get a little more complex. Arrays are a list of data. So in this example, a list of numbers, but this could be a list of strings as well. And they use these square brackets, and then they are separated by commas. So each value in the array is separated by a comma. And I'll show you how we use arrays and how we access the values in the arrays in just a minute. And then we have objects, which are very important in JavaScript. JavaScript is considered an object-oriented programming language, so everything kind of revolves around the object. And the way we define these is with the squiggly brackets, and then key value pairs. And I'm going to talk about objects more, I think, in the next slide. So we can move on if everyone's...
Are we gonna be able to see you write these out too, like on this before?
Yes, I'm going to go a little more in depth on this stuff, actually, because this is the stuff that I feel like I can explain a little bit better. I'm just going to open a console and kind of show you all of this in just a minute.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Cool. So I'm going to talk about objects for just a minute. An object is a set of key value pairs you can access and value in the object by its key name. Got to change that. So given the following object, which we are calling my object, we have 2 keys and 2 values. The first key is key, second key is key 2, first value is value, second value is value 2. We can access a value in the object by using dot notation, which would be my object, because that's what we call the variable, dot key. So that's going to give us value back. Or we can do bracket notation, which is my object, and then in these square brackets, we do the single quotes and then the name of the key. So we could also put key 2 here, and it would give us value 2 on both of these. Also, real quick note, it's recommended that you only use single quotes pretty much ever in JavaScript. So you're never going to really run into double quotes, and if you do, it's fine, but I really recommend against using double quotes ever. So I'll go over dot notation and bracket notation, and I'll show you examples of that in just a minute. I actually think we're almost through this. So let's get to the next slide, which is functions. Oh, actually, did anyone have any questions about this stuff? I know it's a little weird, but I'll definitely explain a little better when I'm actually showing you the code.
What would an example of an object be?
Let's see. So maybe I could have made this a little better, but let's say a lot of people use the cars as an object. So you can have an object that has a key that is the make, and a key that is the model, and a key that is the year, per se, or for instance. And then you would be able to access the, oh god, not in edit mode. You'd be able to access the make by doing myObject.make or car.make, and it would give you the make of the car.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that those were the same thing.
Yeah.
Or yeah.
Did that help explain that a little bit better?
Yes, it did. Thank you.
Okay, sweet. Okay, real quick, we're going to talk about functions. I don't think I'm going to get too deep into this, but I will show you some examples. A function is just a block of code that is reusable, and the function is ran when you invoke it or call it. So you can create a function by using the function keyword. So almost like declaring a variable, except there's no equals sign. You just say function, the name of your function, open and close parentheses, and then you've got squiggly brackets, and then in here is where you'll actually do your logic. And then when we want to call the function, we want to actually run it, we call it by saying the name of the function and then the opening and closing parentheses. So for instance, if we had this add two numbers together or something, declaring it up here wouldn't actually do anything until we run it down here, and then it'll add the two numbers together. Does that make sense for the most part?
Yes.
Great. Okay, and then real quick, function parameters. You can specify parameters when you set up your function so that you can pass data into it. So this is my example here. If we had a function called add, and we have A and we have B, so these are separated by a comma, then we can return A plus B. And then when we go to call our function, when we go to call our function, when we do those parentheses, we would pass in two numbers, and it would return us the sum of those two numbers. And
What do you mean by call?
So calling it is when we do this here.
Oh, okay.
So the function doesn't actually do anything until we call it. So until this point, this is just letting the program know that when we want to do this thing, this is what we want it to do. So I added the return keyword in here. This pretty much does what it sounds like. It just sends you back whatever you want it to. So, and then another thing is I'm doing A plus B, which is something that JavaScript can just do on its own. Any simple arithmetic, JavaScript will be able to handle. So it has plus, minus, division, and multiplication. Yeah, so that's all this does. But just keep in mind that when you create the function, it's not going to do anything until you actually call it. Cool, and then real quick, console.log. This is just an important thing to know. If you ever want to show something in the console, you can do console.log. You do the opening parenthesis and what you want it to log, and then the closing parenthesis. And I will just show you that real quick and what I mean by console, which in this case is the browser itself. So when you open up your Chrome DevTools by doing like right click and inspect, you have this little console tab over here. And anytime there's like an error in a web page, it kind of shows up here. And you can also use it to show you values that you want it to show you. So you can also type directly into the Chrome console. So just for instance, if I do console.log hello, it just sends me back hello. That's all console.log does really. All right, I think that is the last slide on JavaScript. So I'm going to jump into Node, and we are going to go over some examples. And if there's anything that confused you and you want me to go over a little more in depth while I'm actually typing it, let me know, and I'll just do it. So first thing I'll do is I'll create a variable with the let keyword. and let's just do let x equals string. So it's always going to pop out undefined because I didn't do anything with it, but now I have access to this variable. So if I type x, it gives me back that variable. And this can be passed around and used in many different ways. For instance, if I wanted a y variable and I wanted it to be exactly the same as the x variable, I can do that. And now I have x and y, and they're both the same thing. Another thing to remember that I had in one of the slides is that you can always reassign variables. So if I want x to no longer be a string, I could do that, and now x is not a string and y is still a string. So yeah, that's variables. Another thing to remember is that variables in JavaScript specifically are not type safe. So what that means is if I set x to a string, like it has been this whole time, and then randomly I just decide I want it to be a number instead, now it's just a number. JavaScript does not care about what you set your variables to. If I want it to be an array, whoops, now it's an array. Yeah, so that's that. There's no type safety in JavaScript, and kind of just something to keep in mind. Another thing I wanted to go over is kind of how arrays work. There are a lot of weird use cases for arrays, but for now I'll just show you how you would use one. So now that I have x and it has all these numbers in it, actually I'm going to set this to an array of strings instead of numbers. Oops. Cool. So we've got first, second, and third as strings in our array. So the reason that arrays are useful like this is because we can grab single values out of the array just by using its index. And the index is the position that it is in the array. So the first element is at the first position, second is at the second position, third is at the third position. The problem with this in JavaScript and in most programming languages is that arrays are zero indexed, which means that the first position is actually the 0th position, and the second position is actually the first position, and the third position is actually the second position. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So to grab an element out of an array, we say the name of the array, which is x right now, and we do the square bracket, and then we do the position that it's at. So if you want to get first, you would think that you would just type 1, and it would give you back first. But that's going to give us second, because it's 0 indexed. So to get the first element in the array, we have to use 0. That'll give us back the first element in the array. Another interesting thing is that if there's a length property on arrays, and when I get back the length, it does say that it's 3. However, if I try to get the third index of the array, it gives me back undefined, because the length is still 3, but the last element in the array is at the second index. Super weird, kind of just a programming thing that you have to remember, and it applies to other programming languages as well. So if you decide you want to learn other programming languages, very useful thing to know. Does that make sense so far?
So what do you exactly use arrays for?
That's a great question. Any list of data. So when you're working with more complex data, you'll use arrays. But for this example, say, let's see, what's a good example? I'll just use the cars example again. So we want a list of cars, and we're going to show all the cars individually to our user. So we can have like Mazda and Hyundai and Nissan. And now we can grab the first index and we get back Hyundai. Um, and I don't know if that's a great example, but basically any list of data that you need to get from anywhere. So like if you were making a to-do list type of app, you would want to store those all in a list, and you would just have them be like uh, items to do or whatever, and then you would just show those to the user. We'll get more into the interactivity of JavaScript and HTML and how you can like display things from JavaScript to the HTML next time. But yeah, that's more or less how it's used.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Did anyone else have any questions on arrays or variables?
I'm good.
Cool. So I guess I'll talk about objects now real quick. Let's just make an object. We'll call it obj. And use the squigglies to define your object. And I don't know. Does anyone have any suggestions? I'm sick of the car idea. I'm bad at example data.
Buses?
Buses?
What about just like modes of transportation?
Okay, cool. I like that better. So
Sorry.
no, it's okay. You're fine. So yeah, sure, we can. Oh god. I'm using a new keyboard, by the way, so that's why my typing is off. Don't judge me. So let's define transport types, and we'll have it be an object, and we can have these key value pairs. So let's start it off as a simple object. So we'll have like car will be car. Bus can be bus. You can have train, and let's do plane as well. Plane. Cool. So now if I type transport types, it's going to give me that whole object. But the cool thing about objects and the whole dot notation thing is that I can just say transport types dot car. Oh, I typed types wrong. And it'll give me back a car. So this is really useful for when you have like a lot of data and you don't want to put it in an array because you don't know necessarily what each element is. These are always accessible by their keys. So no matter what, when I get transport types dot train, it's going to give me back train. And it's also, objects are also very like optimized, so they run really quick because you're just plucking that element out. It's not searching for it in a list or anything like that. But yeah, that's the basics of objects, and I recommend using dot notation whenever you can. There are some instances where you have to use bracket notation, but this dot notation is nice, and in VS Code it'll give you the like pop-up for it that'll help you complete it. So that's very helpful. Another thing is the the type of the values in these can be any of the types we've already discussed. So you can have a car that has a list, for instance, or a number, and the car list can have like sedan, truck, bus, sure. And now when we get transport types dot car, we get all three of those back. But we can also get transport types dot car and then use our bracket notation because car is a array, and we can get the first element in that array, and we get sedan back. That's a little more confusing. Does that make sense though?
And what can you give like an example of when we would use something like that?
Yeah, I would say like the main example of this is when you're working with like user data. Um, so say like a profile picture on a social media website or something, um,
Mm.
and you want to display whatever the first picture is that they uploaded, you would grab profile dot images at index 0, um, and you could grab that specific picture out. I don't know if that's a great example, but I think that's like kind of an okay like use case.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, also this like object stuff, you just kind of get used to it. It'll become more clear the more you use it. This is how stuff is passed around. So when I was talking about like requests and responses, from the client to the server, when you go to request something, you will most of the time in the browser, you're going to send up a JavaScript object. And that object is going to say, um, I don't know, like you're signing up for a profile, it's going to have um, like an email and a password. And you'll send that up, and the server will see that, and it'll say, oh, we want to create a new account for the email t@t.com and the password my password. And it'll throw that into a database, and then it'll send you back a 200 response code, which is the one that says, looks good, everything's okay.
Okay, that's cool.
Yeah, or it'll send you back some other JavaScript information. So it might send you back like, I don't know if signing up is a good example of that, but if you wanted to like retrieve some specific data and you wanted to send up like, I want pictures of cats, then it would like search their database for cats or whatever and send them all back to you. Then those would come back in a JavaScript object as well.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. I think that's most of what I wanted to go over. Um, any last questions, thoughts? Did anyone want to see any more like CSS stuff or anything, or do you guys feel good?
I
think
would be
it'll-
down
oh,
to see that.
Okay. Um, let's play
And
around.
the thing that we had, that page, is this the client half of
Yes.
the server?
Yeah. Yes, it is. Um,
Okay.
so we are reading this directly from my machine. So you'll notice that there's no like www dot in the URL. It's actually file : //. Um, so it's really just picking this up because ultimately a server is just a computer somewhere else. Um, and HTTPS/www is just the protocol that the browser uses to get that data from the other person's computer. So right now this is on my computer, so I don't have to use HTTP, but if it were elsewhere, that's why we have to use HTTP. So I'm not serving this necessarily, but I'm reading it directly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Cool. And then I think I'll talk about the command line a little bit more next time as well. But for now, we can do some CSS stuff. Any suggestions? You can make anything. I'm a graphic designer now.
Suggestions for what?
What do you want to see on the webpage?
Oh, um, like flowers.
Okay. I mean, we can just go grab an image of flowers. Like this one. So we can just copy the image address directly, do image, paste that in there, and
Can you go over that again? The little thing you just did. We already go.
yeah.
So
So
image.
yeah. So normally, if you're gonna display an image, you'd want to have it kind of in this, like, saved in here. But because I don't want to save random pictures of flowers onto my computer for some reason, I just right-clicked and did copy image address. And because that's hosted somewhere else, it'll just pull that in. But all I did in here was I just typed img, and then I hit tab. And then in the source, I pasted in the link that I copied. And then once I hit save, we should see this big picture of a flower. And then this alt here is the alternate text for the flower. And all that does is when you hover over it, actually, that's not true. When in any case where the image doesn't load or it doesn't have access to the image, it'll show the alternate text. So for someone with like a slow internet connection or an older computer or something, sometimes it'll show this alternate text.
Or if they're using a screen reader, if
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
it reads the alt text. So it's actually when you're making stuff accessible, it's important to use that accurately.
For sure. Yeah, also very difficult thing to do with user-generated content when you want it to have alt text. All right, let's make this flower look a little bit nicer. So we can grab the image tag by using image like that. Since it's the only one on our page, and we can style it. Let's make it smaller. I'll do like 400 pixels. And then let's just do something more fun. I'll give it a border radius of 20 pixels. And that will look like that. So now you have rounded corners, which is what that border radius does. And it'll be 400 pixels in width. When you do width in CSS, it'll kind of auto scale the image, so it'll keep the ratio unless you specifically specify height as well, I think. So if I said, like, I want the height to be 1,000 pixels, yeah, that'll just stretch it out. But if you stick to just using width, it'll kind of carry that ratio.
Does it work if you just do height?
Yes, I believe so.
Is there a certain order you have to do it? Like if you wanted to do both height and width, would you have to type height first or
Nope, you
width?
can go anywhere in here. Yeah, it looks like height works as well, but now it's 400 pixels in height instead of 400 pixels in width, but it still has the same ratio. Yeah.
And will you also be going over like how to kind of tell how big something's gonna be, like how to measure 400 pixels, and like I noticed you were been using that language a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, actually, I was just about to talk about that. That's a good topic to bring up. So yeah, so pixel is one of the many units that you can use in CSS. We also have like relative units, which will be relative to the screen size. So right now, 400 pixels is gonna be 400 pixels. So when I like zoom in and out or change my screen size, it kind of stays at that 400 pixel width. But we can also use percentages, which I highly recommend learning and getting into. I will send a link to some good resources for that in the resources channel. But let's just say we want it to be 50% of the page. Actually, let's do width 50%. So now it should go to around exactly half of my page. And it's always better to use that. It's better for mobile and various devices to use percentages, or there's also you have the option to use VW or VH, which are view width and view height, which is going to be like the total width and the total height of the page. So if I did 50 VW, that's going to basically do the same thing as 50%. But now when I scale it down, it's always going to stay at 50% of the page. Does that make sense?
If you wrote out 50%, it wouldn't rescale as you resize the window, right?
50% like this?
Yeah.
It should. Yeah, it'll still do that.
Oh, I see.
But pixel values is where it won't scale, so it'll just stay at
Right.
pixels.
So what's the difference between VW and like percent?
So percent is going to be the percentage of the containing element. So, or like the parent element. So if we had like a div outside of this image, and we want class to be half, and we set the half class to be width 50%. So now we have two 50%. We have 50% of the whole screen size, which is this one, and then we have 50% of half the screen size. So it's always going to be in relation to the parent element. And if I've done this right, yeah, so that should go to like a quarter of the screen size instead of half.
Okay, I see.
Yeah. Whereas I believe if I do, even if that's 50%, if I try to make this 50 view width, it still scales up.
Got it.
I was gonna ask, because when I was doing a couple of exercises with CSS, I think the main thing I was struggling with was kind of just making a page responsive. So like when you're going back and forth between the sides of the screen. So would you suggest kind of sticking to the percentages for that, or would you go with like the VW instead?
I guess it really depends on what you want. But I use them both in different circumstances. So if you just have an element like this inside of the body, and you wanted to size it based on the size of the body, you can totally use percentage. Or if you have, you will come into places where you will want to use a pixel value. And if you want it to always be half of whatever that pixel value is, you can always do 50% of that in the child element. But yeah, it kind of depends. I would recommend sticking to percent unless something is breaking for you, and then you can kind of try view width and view height.
Okay.
But I think percent is kind of the most commonly used one, yeah.
Could you
And
tell us of like a time or like an example of where you would be using percentage and VS like size up something? Like would it be in a website or an app
Where you would use percentage to do what? Sorry, I missed that.
to make it bigger and stuff? Like is that the kind of the flower image?
Mm-hmm.
Would that be like in a website or like kind of data or an app
Um,
or
Typically it would be
anything?
in a website because we're using web
Oh,
languages right now. So
Okay.
Basically, the reason we want to do this is so that when, because like something like 90% of browsing is done on mobile phones. I don't know the exact number, but it's a lot. Um, and so we want to make sure that our websites can be viewed on um, like desktop computers all the way down to mobile phones. Um, and because we want it to be a certain size, we always want it to stay at that size. So like if this was still let's make it 100 view width, or let's make it like 800 pixels. Now when we look at it on a desktop, it looks good. If we try to go to a mobile phone, it's not quite the same. I don't know, it's being responsive for me for some reason, probably because of this. But you'll see how like it cuts off right here for us right now, but then when we go to a mobile phone, it's like the full size of the screen. So kind of just to mitigate that and get around mobile phone usage versus like desktop or laptop usage. Screen sizes are a pain when it comes to programming.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah. Let's see. We've been going for about an hour and a half. If y'all feel good, I'm good to end it here. If you have more questions, I am happy to answer them.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah,
sure.
thank you.
I don't have a like full class schedule yet, but we can discuss another night that works and do this again soon.
Yeah, for sure. I really appreciate that.
Of course, I'm happy to be here. If anyone has questions that come up or they're like practicing and they run into an issue, just let me know in the help channel or whatever.
Cool, thank you.
All right.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Could you drop some like resources in the resource channel of like what I don't know, certain definitions for some of the things you were explaining if you have them? And I also know that you said you were going to post the slide in there as well, so I think that would be helpful.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can do all that for sure.
Okay, Cincy, thank you.
All right. Thank you guys for being here.